6 years is a very long time to be awake. For Joo Taekwon, the most powerful man in Seoul, every day was a battle he won, but every night was a war he lost. By day, he moved through the city like a king made of glass and steel. He sat in tall buildings and made decisions that moved millions of dollars. His face was like a mask of perfect porcelain, sharp and cold. People called him the silent dragon because he was strong and scary. But when the sun went down, the dragon became a prisoner. Taekwon lived in a penthouse that felt more like a tomb of gold than a home. Everything was expensive: the marble floors, the silk curtains, and the softest beds money could buy. Yet, he could not find the one thing every human needs: rest. For exactly 2,190 days, he had not slept through the night. He would lay in his dark room, staring at the red numbers on his clock. The air would grow heavy, smelling of old fear. Then, at exactly 12:30 a.m., the ghost would arrive. It wasn't a real ghost, but a memory so loud it felt like an attack. A sharp gunshot would echo in his mind, the same sound from the night his wife died. Every night he felt her weight against his chest again. The heavy front doors of the Joo mansion opened, but the air inside did not get any warmer. Somto Okafor stepped into the grand hallway, her small suitcase clutched in her hand. She was far from her home in Nigeria, and the cold marble floors of Seoul felt very different under her feet. She wore a simple black dress with a crisp white apron. Her dark, rich skin glowed against the white walls, and her natural hair was pulled back neatly. She looked small in the giant house, but her eyes were calm. Madame Oh Ji-yoon stood at the bottom of the wide stairs. She was a woman who looked like she was made of iron and expensive silk. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and her eyes were as sharp as needles. She did not smile at Somto. Instead, she looked her up and down, checking for any signs of weakness. "You are the new girl," Madame O said, her voice sounding like dry paper. "You have traveled a long way to work here. You must understand that this is not a normal house. My son is a very important man, and he is a very sick man. He has no patience for mistakes." Somto nodded politely. "I understand, madam." Madame O stepped closer, her face turning very serious. "There is one rule you must never break. Do not look him in the eye. When he enters a room, you look at the floor. When you serve him his tea, you look at his shoes. My son, Taekwon, carries a darkness that scares most people. If you stare at him, he will see it as a challenge. The last 3 maids ran away crying because of his gaze. Do you understand?" Somto felt a strange ripple of curiosity, but she simply lowered her head. "I will do my work well, madam." As the sun began to set, the house grew even quieter. Somto began her duties, moving through the kitchen and the long hallways. The other servants moved like ghosts. They didn't speak and they didn't laugh. They all seemed to be waiting for something scary to happen. Suddenly, the front door opened again. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. Joo Taekwon walked in. He was tall with broad shoulders, wearing a suit that looked like armor. His skin was pale and smooth, but his face was so sharp it looked painful. He didn't look at anyone. He moved with a heavy, slow walk, his footsteps echoing like a heartbeat against the marble. Somto was standing near the dining room door. As he walked past, she remembered the madam's warning. She was supposed to look at the floor. She was supposed to be afraid. But Somto felt something else. She felt a deep, cold sadness coming from him. It was a feeling she knew from back home, the feeling of a person who had been carrying a heavy weight for way too long. Instead of looking at his shoes, Somto raised her head. Taekwon stopped. He turned his head slowly, his dark, almond-shaped eyes locking onto hers. They were the eyes of a man who hadn't slept in a lifetime. They were deep, sunken, and filled with a cold fire. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to shake and drop her gaze to the floor like everyone else. But Somto didn't move. She looked right back at him. She didn't look with anger or fear. She looked with a soft, quiet gaze that seemed to see right through his silent dragon mask. In that moment, she didn't see a scary mafia boss. She saw a man who was drowning in the middle of a golden palace. Taekwon's jaw tightened. For a second, his cold look faltered. He was shocked that this petite girl with the warm brown skin wasn't trembling. For the first time in 6 years, someone was looking at him as a person, not a monster or a king. He stared at her for a long beat, his dark eyebrows pulling together in a frown. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked up the stairs, his black coat flowing behind him like a shadow. Somto stood there for a moment, her heart beating a little faster. She knew she had broken the biggest rule in the house, but as she watched him disappear into the shadows of the second floor, she knew she hadn't seen a dragon. She had only seen a man who was very, very tired. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked toward midnight. Inside the giant mansion, the air felt thick and heavy, like it was waiting for something bad to happen. Most of the servants had already hidden away in their rooms, afraid to be caught in the hallway when the 12:30 ghost arrived. But Somto was still awake. She stood in the center of the kitchen, which was filled with cold steel and expensive machines that no one ever seemed to use for joy. Somto opened a small wooden box she had brought all the way from her village. Inside were dried roots, leaves, and a special kind of honey that was dark and tasted a little bit bitter. This was her grandmother's secret. Back home, this tea was used for people whose minds were too noisy to find peace. She moved quietly, heating water in a small pot. As the water began to bubble, she added the herbs. Soon, a new smell began to fill the kitchen. It was earthy, warm, and sweet, the scent of bitter honey. It did not belong in this cold marble house, but it felt right. Just as she was pouring the dark liquid into a simple clay cup, she heard a sound. It was the slow, dragging step of someone who was exhausted. Joo Taekwon walked into the kitchen. He had taken off his suit jacket, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the neck. His pale skin looked almost gray under the bright lights, and the shadows under his eyes were deeper than they had been that afternoon. He looked like a man who was walking toward a cliff. He stopped when he saw her. His dark eyes narrowed, looking at the steam rising from the cup. "Why are you still here?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, like stones rubbing together. "It is almost time. You should be hiding like the others." Somto did not look down at the floor. She held the warm cup with both hands. "I was making something for the cold," she said softly. "The air in this house is very lonely, Mr. Joo. In my home, we drink this when the night feels too long." Taekwon walked closer, his tall frame blocking the light. He looked down at the dark tea. He had tried every pill Dr. Park could give him. He had tried the most expensive medicines in the world, and none of them worked. Why would a cup of leaves from a girl he didn't know make any difference? But the smell was strange. It didn't smell like a pharmacy. It smelled like rain on dry ground. It smelled like a memory he couldn't quite catch. Out of pure curiosity, and perhaps because he was too tired to argue, Taekwon reached out. His long, thin fingers brushed against Somto's warm hand as he took the cup. The touch was brief, but he felt a jolt of warmth that made his heart skip a beat. He took a small sip. The taste was strong and a bit sharp at first, but then it turned sweet and warm in his throat. "Sit down, Mr. Joo," Somto said. It wasn't an order, but her voice was so calm that he found himself pulling out a wooden chair and sitting at the small kitchen table. As he drank the tea, Somto began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, an Igbo lullaby that her grandmother used to sing when the storms were too loud outside. The sound was steady and soft, like the beating of a heart. Taekwon felt the muscles in his shoulders finally start to relax. The red numbers of the clock on the wall changed to 12:25, then 12:29. Usually, this was when the panic would start. This was when the phantom gunshot would scream in his ears and his heart would start to race. He waited for the pain. He waited for the nightmare to tear his mind apart. But the sound of Somto's humming was like a shield. The bitter honey tea felt like a warm blanket spreading through his blood. 12:30 a.m. came. The minute passed in total silence. For the first time in 2,190 days, the gunshot did not fire. The ghost did not come. Taekwon's heavy, almond-shaped eyes began to flutter. His head felt like a lead weight. He tried to stay awake, to ask her what was happening, but the peace was too strong. His chin sank toward his chest. His breathing slowed down, becoming deep and regular. Somto stopped humming and watched him. The most feared man in Seoul was slumped over the kitchen table, his forehead resting on his crossed arms. His sharp face looked softer now that the tension was gone. He wasn't a dragon anymore. He was just a man who had finally found the shore after drowning for 6 long years. Somto stayed in the chair across from him, keeping watch in the quiet kitchen as Joo Taekwon finally, truly, fell asleep. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, but the mansion was quieter than usual. Dr. Park Jung-ho walked through the front doors with his heavy black bag. He looked tired, his hair messy with gray strands and his eyes showing years of worry. He expected to find Joo Taekwon in his study, pacing the floor with a red face and shaking hands. That was how it usually was after a night of no sleep. Instead, he found the boss sitting in a chair by the window. Taekwon was dressed in a clean shirt, but his eyes looked different. For the first time, they weren't bloodshot. The deep, dark shadows under his eyes seemed a little lighter. He wasn't moving. He was just watching the garden outside. "Taekwon," the doctor whispered, sounding shocked. Did you actually rest?" Taekwon turned his head slowly. His sharp jaw moved as he spoke. "I slept, Jung-ho, from midnight until the sun came up." The doctor gasped. He quickly pulled out his tools. He wrapped a band around Taekwon's arm to check his blood pressure. He put his stethoscope against Taekwon's chest and listened. For years, Taekwon's heart had sounded like a drum being hit too fast and too hard. It had been a heart that was starving and scared. But today, the beat was steady. It was strong and slow. "This is a miracle," Dr. Park said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your heart vitals have stabilized. The pressure is down. If you keep sleeping like this, you might actually live." Taekwon looked over at the door. Somto was passing by in the hallway, carrying a tray of clean dishes. She didn't stop. And she didn't look in. She just moved with that soft, quiet grace that seemed to calm the air around her. Taekwon didn't say her name, but the doctor saw where he was looking. Dr. Park closed his bag and sat down across from the Mafia boss. His face became very serious. "I have to warn you, Taekwon. You have spent 6 years being a dragon. You built a world of ice and steel to protect yourself because you were hurting. Now, this girl is melting that ice. You are becoming soft. You are becoming human again." Taekwon narrowed his almond-shaped eyes. "Is that not what you wanted, doctor? You told me I was dying." "Physically, yes," Dr. Park replied, leaning forward. "But in your world, being human is dangerous. A dragon survives because he never sleeps and he never trusts. The moment you start to feel peace, you become a target. The dragon inside you has kept you alive in the underworld. It is going to fight back. It will not want to be vulnerable." The doctor stood up to leave, but he paused at the door. "Be careful, Taekwon. Sleep is a gift, but it makes you close your eyes. In a house full of secrets and enemies, closing your eyes is the most dangerous thing you can do. The people who work for you might not like a boss who finds peace in a cup of tea." Taekwon stayed silent as the doctor left. He looked at his hands. For the first time in 6 years, they weren't shaking. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, but he also felt the doctor's warning like a cold wind. He was the silent dragon, the man who ruled through fear. Could he keep his power if he allowed a petite girl with a soft voice to see his heart? He knew the dragon within was already growling, afraid of the softness that Somto brought into his dark, golden tomb. The rain was tapping against the windows of the study, a sound that usually made Taekwon feel like he was losing his mind. But today, he felt different. He was sitting at his large desk, looking at a file about a new shipping route in Busan. For years, the word Busan had been a curse to him. It was the place where his world had burned down. A soft knock came at the door. Somto entered, carrying a small cloth to dust the bookshelves. She moved quietly, respecting the silence of the room. As she reached the shelf near the window, a small, worn piece of paper fell out from the pocket of her apron. It landed on the rug near Taekwon's feet. Taekwon leaned down and picked it up before she could. It was an old photograph, the edges curled and yellowed by time. In the picture, a tall man with a kind, wide smile stood in front of a giant blue shipping crane. He was wearing a bright orange safety vest. Somto looked just like him. They had the same gentle jawline and expressive eyes. "Is this your father?" Taekwon asked. His voice was not cold, but it was heavy with a new kind of interest. Somto stopped her work and walked toward the desk. Her face looked sad but proud. "Yes, Mr. Joo. That is my father, Chidi. He was a foreman. He worked at the Busan port for many years. He sent all his money back to Nigeria so I could go to school." Taekwon's heart gave a strange thump. He looked closer at the photo. In the background, behind the smiling man, he could see a specific logo on a warehouse door. It was the symbol of the Park Group, the company that had belonged to his enemies 6 years ago. "When did he die, Somto?" Taekwon asked. His eyes were locked on the photo, his jaw tightening. 6 years ago," she whispered. "It was a terrible night. The police said there was an explosion in Warehouse 7. They called it an accident, a gas leak, but my father was a careful man. I never believed it was an accident." Taekwon felt a chill spread through his body. He stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He walked to a locked safe in the wall and pulled out a small black notebook. He flipped through the pages until he found a date he had carved into his memory with fire. "The night of the explosion," Taekwon said, his voice barely a whisper. "What was the exact time?" Somto looked at him, her large eyes filled with confusion. "The news said the fire started at 12:30 a.m. The room went completely silent. Taekwon felt like the air had been sucked out of the study. 12:30 a.m. That was the exact minute his car had been trapped on a rainy street in Seoul. That was the exact minute the gunshot had cracked through the air and his wife, Soo-jin, had fallen into his arms. He looked at Somto, and for a moment he didn't see a maid. He saw a partner in pain. They were both victims of the same dark night. The accident at the port hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a distraction. The explosion was meant to draw the police and the guards away from the city so that the assassins could kill the silent dragon. "My father died because of a lie," Somto said, her voice trembling. "And your wife died because of a bullet. We are both living with the same shadow, aren't we?" Taekwon reached out, his hand hovering near the photograph. For 6 years, while he thought he was the only one who had been destroyed that night, he thought his pain was a private island. But here was this girl, from a world away, carrying the same scar. "They used his life to hide their crime," Taekwon said, his dark eyes turning into obsidian. The dragon inside him wasn't growling at Somto anymore. It was growling at the people who had hurt them both. He realized then that their meeting wasn't just luck. It was justice. The man who couldn't sleep and the girl who lost her father were finally standing in the same light. The mystery of the 12:30 ghost was finally starting to show its true, ugly face. While peace was growing inside the mansion, a dark poison was spreading just outside its walls. In a small, dimly lit office at the far end of the estate, a man named Min-ho sat in the shadows. But Min-ho was Taekwon's top lieutenant. For years, he had been the boss's right hand, the man who handled the roughest parts of the business. He was used to a leader who was cold, alert, and ready to strike at any moment. He liked the silent dragon because a scary boss meant Min-ho had more power. But lately, Min-ho didn't like what he saw. He watched from the balcony as Taekwon walked through the garden with Somto. He saw the way the boss's shoulders were no longer tight with stress. He saw that Taekwon's hands were steady and his eyes were clear. To a doctor, this was a miracle. To a traitor like Minho, it was a weakness. Minho pulled out a burner phone, his fingers tapping against the cold metal. He opened a messaging app that left no trace. He began to type a message to the Kim family, the rivals who had been waiting for years to take Taekwon's crown. "The dragon is sleeping," the message read. "He has found a distraction. A girl from a different world has cast a spell on him. He is soft now. He is vulnerable." Minho hated the change. He believed that a mafia boss should never find peace. In his mind, the tea Somto made was like a slow poison that was making Taekwon lose his edge. Minho remembered the Busan port explosion. He remembered how he had helped cover up the truth back then, working in the shadows to make sure no one ever found out it was an inside job. If Taekwon kept getting closer to Somto, he might start asking questions. He might find out that the people he trusted most were the ones who had helped pull the trigger 6 years ago. Later that afternoon, Minho met with a few other guards in the gym. "Have you seen him?" Minho whispered, his voice full of scorn. "He spent an hour today talking to the maid about flowers. The man who used to rule Seoul with an iron fist is now hiding in the kitchen. We are losing our territory because he wants to dream." The guards looked at each other with worried eyes. In their world, if the leader is not strong, everyone is at risk. Minho saw the fear in their faces and smiled. He was like a serpent in a beautiful garden, whispering lies to make everyone turn against the boss. "If he won't lead us, someone else must," Minho said. "Tonight I will send the Kims his private schedule. When they move, the dragon will be too tired or too happy to fight back. And once he is gone, the girl will be dealt with too." Inside the main house, Taekwon felt a strange shiver down his spine, but he ignored it. He was looking at Somto, who was humming a song while she polished the silver. He felt more like a man than he had in a lifetime. He didn't know that his oldest friend was currently selling his life for a pile of gold. He didn't know that the peace he had finally found was about to become the very thing that lured his enemies to his front door. The serpent was ready to strike, and the garden was no longer safe. The night air was still and heavy, like a breath held too long. Inside the mansion, the lights were low, casting long, thin shadows across the marble floors. For the first time in years, Taekwon was not pacing his room or counting the seconds with a racing heart. He sat in the large chair in his study, his eyes closed in a light, peaceful rest. The bitter honey tea Somto had made earlier that evening was still a warm memory in his chest. But as the clock on his desk ticked toward 12:30 a.m., something changed. The silence of the house didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like an alarm. Taekwon's eyes snapped open. He didn't feel the usual fog of a nightmare. Instead, his mind was sharp and clear. He heard a sound that didn't belong, a soft click of a lock and the quiet scrape of a boot against the balcony floor. Suddenly, the 12:30 gunshot returned. But it wasn't the muffled, echoing sound from his memory. It was a sharp, ear-splitting crack that shattered the glass of his balcony doors. The sound was real. "Taekwon!" a voice screamed from down the hall. It was Somto. The silent dragon didn't hesitate. For 6 years, he had been a man dying of tiredness, but tonight, he was a man who had slept. He was fast. He stood up and pulled a hidden weapon from under his desk, just as 3 men in black masks burst through the broken glass. They moved like shadows, their suppressed guns coughing quiet sparks of fire. Taekwon moved with a ferocity he hadn't felt since he was a young soldier in the underworld. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the girl who had brought him back from the dead. He ducked behind his heavy oak desk as bullets chewed into the wood. He fired back, his aim steady and true. One attacker fell, and Taekwon moved toward the door, his heart beating with a rhythmic, powerful force. Outside in the hallway, the mansion was in chaos. The alarms were wailing, a high-pitched scream that tore through the night. Taekwon saw more assassins coming up the grand stairs. They were professional and cold, but Taekwon was something different. He was a protector. He moved like a whirlwind of black silk and steel, taking down two men who tried to block his path. He didn't head for the exit. He headed for the servants' quarters. He found Somto trapped in the kitchen. She was cornered against the marble island, holding a heavy metal pot as a shield. Her eyes were large and filled with terror, but she wasn't crying. Two men were moving toward her, their guns raised. "Get away from her!" Taekwon roared. He didn't care about the bullets that hissed past his shoulders. He threw himself into the kitchen, his broad shoulders slamming into one man and sending him flying against the steel refrigerator. He grabbed the second man's arm, twisting it until the gun fell to the floor, and finished the fight with a brutal strike. Taekwon stood in the center of the kitchen, his chest heaving. His pale skin was stained with a small cut on his cheek, and his white shirt was rumpled, but his eyes were bright with a protective fire. He turned to Somto and reached out, his hand shaking just a little bit. "Are you hurt?" he gasped, his voice raw. Somto shook her head, her breath coming in quick, short gasps. She looked at the man standing before her. He wasn't the tired, half-dead boss she had met a week ago. He was a warrior. "I'm okay, Taekwon. You came for me." "I will always come for you," he whispered. But as he pulled her close, Taekwon looked toward the hallway and saw Min-ho standing in the distance. The lieutenant wasn't fighting the assassins. He was watching. In that moment, my Taekwon realized the doctor's warning had come true. The dragon had woken up, but the garden was burning and the real serpent was still hiding in the smoke. The 1230 ghost was finally real, and Taekwon knew the war was only just beginning. The garage of the mansion was filled with the roar of engines and the smell of burnt rubber. Taekwon gripped the steering wheel of his black sedan so hard his knuckles turned white. Somto sat in the passenger seat, her seatbelt pulled tight across her chest. She was silent, but her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Behind them, two SUVs filled with his most loyal guards followed closely. "Stay down, Somto," Taekwon ordered, his voice sounding like cold iron. He wasn't the tired man who needed tea anymore. He was the silent dragon again, sharp and focused. Far ahead, a silver sports car tore through the night. Inside was Min-ho, the traitor. He was racing toward the Incheon docks, hoping to find a boat and escape into the dark sea. Taekwon pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The car surged forward, weaving through the late-night traffic of Seoul like a black bullet. The chase moved onto the long, open highway that led to the coast. The city lights became a blur of blue and yellow. Min-ho was driving like a madman, swerving between trucks and narrow lanes. Taekwon didn't blink. He used the discipline he had learned over many years, calculating every move before he made it. He wasn't just driving, he was hunting. "He's gaining on us," Somto whispered, looking at the side mirror. Another car, filled with the Kim family's shooters, had appeared behind them. New sparks flew as bullets hit the back of Taekwon's armored car. Taekwon didn't panic. He waited for the right moment. As they approached a sharp turn near the water, he slammed his foot on the brake and spun the wheel. The heavy sedan drifted perfectly, blocking the path of the shooter's car and sending it spinning into a guardrail. Without stopping, Taekwon sped up again, his eyes locked on the silver car disappearing into the docks. They reached the Incheon harbor, a place of giant metal containers and rusty cranes. The air tasted of salt and old machinery. Min-ho's car screeched to a halt near a dark warehouse, the same kind of warehouse where Somto's father had died 6 years ago. Min-ho jumped out and ran, tripping over thick ropes and metal chains. Taekwon stopped his car and stepped out before the engine even finished humming. He moved with a slow, terrifying calmness. He didn't need to run. He knew this place. He had built his empire on these docks. "Min-ho!" Taekwon's voice echoed against the metal containers. It was a roar that sounded like it came from the bottom of a cave. The traitor reached the edge of the pier, trapped between the deep water and the man he had betrayed. He pulled out a gun, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold it. "Don't come any closer!" Min-ho screamed. "You've gone soft, Taekwon. You're not a dragon anymore. You're just a man who wants to sleep." Taekwon kept walking. He didn't look afraid of the gun. He looked like the king of the shadows. He used the dragon inside him, the part that was strong and disciplined, to move through the darkness. He stepped into the light of a single flickering lamp. His pale skin looked like marble, and his dark eyes were as cold as the ocean behind Minho. "I didn't go soft, Minho," Taekwon said, his voice quiet but deadly. "I just finally woke up, and now that I can see clearly, I see exactly what you are." With a sudden, lightning-fast move, Taekwon disarmed Minho before the traitor could even pull the trigger. He grabbed Minho by the collar and slammed him against a rusted shipping container. The sound of the metal hitting metal was loud and final. Minho was trapped. The chase was over, and the reckoning had finally begun. Taekwon stood over his old friend, his face showing no mercy, ready to finish the war that had started 6 years ago in the rain. Minho was shaking against the cold metal of the shipping container. His breath came in loud, scared gasps. Taekwon's hand was tight around his throat, and in his other hand, Taekwon held a heavy gun. The silent dragon was back, and his eyes were full of a dark, killing fire. For 6 years, this man had been the reason for Taekwon's pain. Minho had helped kill his wife. Minho had helped kill Samto's father. Minho had stolen 6 years of his life. "Please, Taekwon," Minho begged, his voice cracking. "We were brothers. I did it for the business. You were becoming too weak." Taekwon's face didn't change. He looked like a statue made of ice. He pressed the cold barrel of the gun against Minho's forehead. Every part of his body wanted to pull the trigger. The dragon inside him was screaming for blood. It whispered that this was the only way to be safe. It whispered that a mafia boss must destroy his enemies to stay king. But just as Taekwon's finger began to squeeze, a sound drifted into his mind. It wasn't the sound of a gunshot or the roar of the ocean. It was a low, rhythmic humming. He remembered the smell of bitter honey and the warmth of the kitchen. He heard Samto's voice singing that soft Igbo lullaby. It was the sound that had finally given him rest. It was the sound of a person who chose kindness over fear. Taekwon looked back toward his car. Samto was standing near the open door. She wasn't shouting, and she wasn't cheering for him to kill. She was just watching him with those large, expressive eyes. She looked at him with the same gaze she used when she adjusted his collar, a gaze that saw a man, not a monster. If he pulled this trigger, Taekwon realized he would be going back into the dark. He would be the man who ruled by blood again. He would be the man who couldn't sleep because his hands were too dirty. He would be exactly what Minho wanted him to be. Taekwon took a deep, shaky breath. The fire in his eyes slowly cooled. He didn't want to be the dragon anymore. He wanted to be the man who could look Samto in the eye and not feel ashamed. With a sudden movement, Taekwon pulled the gun away. He didn't fire. Instead, he used the heavy handle of the weapon to strike Minho across the jaw, knocking him to the ground. Minho slumped over, groaning in pain, but he was alive. "I am not like you, Minho," Taekwon said, his voice steady and strong. "And I am not like the man I was 6 years ago." Taekwon turned to his guards, who had finally surrounded the area. "Tie him up," he ordered. "Take the files from the Busan warehouse. I hand everything over to the police and the chief prosecutor. Every bribe, every shipment, every name. I want him to spend the rest of his life in a small cell, thinking about the empire he tried to steal." The guards looked surprised. In their world, traitors usually disappeared into the sea. But they saw the look on Taekwon's face. It was a new kind of authority. It was the look of a leader who was no longer afraid of the truth. Taekwon walked away from the pier, his long black coat fluttering in the wind. He walked straight to Samto. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the tiredness of a man who had finished a long, hard day of work. "You didn't do it," Samto whispered as he reached her. She reached out and touched his arm, her warm hand grounding him. "I chose to stay human," Taekwon replied. He looked at her and felt a peace that was stronger than any tea. The gunshot in his head was gone. The weight on his chest was gone. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. He led her back to the car, leaving the shadows of the docks behind, ready to drive toward a morning that finally belonged to them both. The sun did not creep into the room like a stranger this morning. Instead, it poured through the large windows of the penthouse like a warm, welcome guest. The light hit the white marble floors and turned the gold decorations into soft, glowing embers. On the large bed, Joo Taekwon moved slowly. He didn't jump up with a racing heart. He didn't gasp for air as if he were drowning. He opened his eyes and looked at the digital clock on the side table. It was 8 a.m. Taekwon laid there for a moment, simply breathing. For 6 long years, he had been a prisoner of 12:30 a.m. He had lived his life in the dark, waiting for a ghost that never went away. But today, the nightmare was dead. The silence in his head was not empty or scary. It was peaceful. He felt a strange, heavy comfort in his muscles, the kind of feeling you only get when you have truly, deeply rested. The silent dragon was gone, and in his place was a man who finally knew what it felt like to be home. He stood up and walked to the window. Below him, the city of Seoul was waking up. Cars moved like tiny toys on the streets, and people were starting their day. For the first time, Taekwon didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like he was a part of the world again. He washed his face, looking at himself in the mirror. The shadows under his almond-shaped eyes were fading. His skin looked healthy, and his jaw wasn't pressed tight with anger. He followed a familiar, wonderful smell down the hallway. As he reached the kitchen, he stopped at the doorway. The room was filled with the bright morning light. Samto was there, standing by the stove. She wasn't wearing her formal maid's apron today. She wore a simple, soft sweater. She was humming that same Igbo lullaby, her voice mixing with the sound of breakfast cooking in a pan. She turned around and saw him standing there. A wide, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Good morning, Taekwon," she said. Her voice was as warm as the tea she used to make. "You're late. I thought you might sleep forever." Taekwon walked into the kitchen, his bare feet quiet on the floor. He didn't go to the head of the long, cold dining table. He walked straight to the small breakfast table where they had sat on that first night. "I think I've been asleep for 6 years, Samto," he said, his voice soft and steady. "I'm finally waking up." He sat down, and Samto placed a plate in front of him. It wasn't the fancy, expensive food the old chefs used to make. It was simple and honest. She sat across from him, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. There were no secrets between them anymore. The mystery of the Busan port was solved, the traitors were gone, and the heavy weight of the past had been lifted. "What will you do now?" Samto asked, her dark eyes watching him with kindness. Taekwon reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was warm, a contrast to the cold marble world he had built. "I will be a leader who doesn't need to hide in the shadows. I will make sure the people who hurt our families never do it again. But mostly," he paused, looking at the sun shining on the kitchen tiles, "I think I will just enjoy the morning. I want to learn more about the world outside this cage." The mansion was no longer a tomb of gold. With Samto there, the air felt light. The cold silence had been replaced by the sound of a boiling kettle and quiet conversation. Joo Taekwon, the man who owned the city, finally realized that the greatest treasure wasn't in his safe or his bank account. It was the peace of an 8 a.m. sun and the hand of the girl who had taught a dragon how to dream. The war was over. The man was finally, truly home.